I'm going to give an honest trigger warning for the novel I'm about to talk about. It's not a pleasant thing. I talk a lot on this channel about subversive and transgressive novels, often written by women and queer people and other minority groups, books that have daring and dark and twisted content that can often trigger people, and I don't usually give trigger warnings when talking about them. This book is different, so trigger warning for every kind of abuse, especially every kind of abuse you can imagine committed by a man towards a woman. I'm making it vague because the specific kinds of abuse here are things I can't say on YouTube. But you know what I'm talking about. And this is also a book written by a man, so that's something I've had to think about a lot while reading and reviewing this. Tread lightly, there's your warning, but I do think this is a very, very smart and powerful novel that I'm excited to talk about, so let's dig in. Cannibals is a literary novella by Japanese author Shinya Tanaka. It was published back in 2011 and adapted into a film 2 years later. The film in English is called The Backwater, and I haven't seen it yet. But from what I've read about the film online, it does accurately adapt the source material. Now, this tiny little 80-page novella actually won the Akutagawa Prize, which is the most prestigious literary prize in Japan. It has just been translated into English brilliantly by Kalau Almany and published by Honford Star. Cannibals is set at the very end of the 1980s in a small, working-class riverside community. Our protagonist is a teenage boy called Toma, and Toma has a specific fear. It's unique in the sense that it's a fear I don't hear people talk about a lot, but surely it's a fear that permeates our societal consciousness. This is the fear of turning into his father. His father, Madoka, is a serial abuser of women. One of his father's victims was obviously his mother, Jinko. She left Toma's father just after Toma was born, but she still lives in the neighborhood. In fact, Toma and his father live in a home on the riverside, and she sits across the river, working as someone who cleans freshly caught fish. She has one hand, and she uses a prosthetic on the other to help her with her work. And Toma sees her pretty often. He walks past her, and the two of them have an awkward, strained relationship which at no point feels like mother and son. They make idle chit-chat, kind of like how neighbors do. And she talks constantly about how Toma's father is an awful abuser. Right now, Toma's father has a girlfriend called Kotoko, and we learn early on that Kotoko is pregnant. She's been living with Toma and his father for a while, and she is also a victim of his abuse. And Toma, being a teenage boy, has a girlfriend called Chigusa. She seems like a sweet girl at first. The two of them are getting along well, but Toma has this fear, this private internal fear that he's going to turn into his father, that he will abuse women just as his father has done. This fear envelops him, and as the novel goes along, it starts to come true. It's difficult to say much more than that. This is the setup, this is what the blurb says, but this is an 80-page story that you can read in a single sitting, so it's kind of hard to avoid spoiling it. I've given you your trigger warning, I've given you roughly what the book is about, but this is, in a weird way, a kind of beautiful novel, at least in its telling and in its translation. There is a sense of the surreal in this novel. The fact that Toma's mother sits on the riverbank, just on the other side of the water from her son, has an awkward kind of neighborly relationship with him, and is defined by the fact that she was abused and the fact that she cleans fish with a prosthetic attachment. That is a surreal quality, and it goes beyond that. The final 20 pages of this novel are a frantic and unsettling roller coaster of strangeness that takes place in a rainstorm that feels almost biblical. The events of that final quarter of the book ramp up the surreal quality of this thing even more. And what I appreciate about the surreal quality of this novel, which is very subtle, it's not exactly magical realism or anything like that, it's just feverish. What I appreciate about that is that it separates the book just ever so slightly from reality, letting us know that this isn't so much real as it is a nightmare, the kind of nightmare that you wake up from red and sweating and feeling claustrophobic. You need to put the lights on and open the windows, get some fresh air, take a walk around your home, shake off the dream. That's how it feels. And the reason it feels like that are twofold. One, it has horrific content, And two, it feels feverish and claustrophobic in its subtly surreal nature. I feel like this is the author letting us know that yes, this is triggering, yes, this is upsetting, yes, this is potentially traumatizing. It is one of the darkest stories I have ever read in my life, but it isn't real. That's why a lot of dark stories with political allegories take place in science fiction and fantasy worlds, to help us deconstruct their themes, their politics, their social messaging through a slightly abstract or detached lens. That's kind of what this book is doing here. It is set in a feverish nightmare. Cannibals is going to be enormously divisive. People are going to be upset by it, they're going to hate it. They might call it things like torture porn and trauma porn, but I don't agree with that. And I have to be careful to disagree with that, pretty much just because this is written by a man, and this is about masculine abuse of women. That in and of itself is a dangerous thing for a man to try to write. And I'm not saying that because men can't be victims of abuse, including domestic abuse. I would never say that. That is very much true. Men are victims of abuse. From partners of any gender, from parents, from their own children, men are victims too. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the abuse in here is very specifically hyper-masculine domestic abuse of women. It is sexualized, it is physical, it is dominant, and it is written by a man. That can be, on the face of it, a difficult thing to accept and to even arguably defend. But I think Shinya Tanaka pulls it off. And I think he pulls it off because of this feverish quality that he adds to it, as well as the ending that he writes, which obviously I won't spoil. And what also helped is the fact that this really reminded me of Brickmakers by Selva Almada. Selva Almada is a wonderful feminist Argentinian author who writes a lot about toxic masculinity, both in her fiction and her non-fiction. And her novel Brickmakers is about cycles of abuse and inherited abuse. Young men walking in their father's footsteps because they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to escape that cycle. Inherited abuse, inherited behaviors, inherited toxic masculinity. This book explores that same thing, but it does even more besides. And I was really, really impressed by that. I feel like Shinya Tanaka has his finger on the button when it comes to this. I think he has a sensitivity that is rare to see in male writers writing about such a sensitive topic. I also mentioned before that this book is beautiful in its writing, and I'm just going to read you from the opening page. Toma got off the bus on the freeway and walked down a narrow road bordered by old homes and buildings filled with rented shops and offices until he reached the river, which he then walked along following its current. The river was about 10 meters across. It was low tide, and the yellow earth of the riverbed was visible through the shallow water. Stones of all shapes and sizes, a broken bicycle that looked as though even if someone tried to ride it, it could do nothing but turn right for eternity. A black umbrella whose broken frame thrust out of the water like the mast of a ship. A tin-plated bucket, which except for the bright crimson handle was rusted into a shapeless heap. Wooden fencing, plastic bags swollen with sand. These and other pieces of trash filled the river. And that description goes on for another page. It is wonderful scene setting, very reminiscent of a stage play. It kind of reminded me of Mice and Men. If you ever go back and read Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, it has like 6 chapters and each of them starts with a page-long description, because Of Mice and Men was originally written as a play and then adapted to be a novel. This feels really, really similar to that. The stage-like quality again enhances the surrealness of it. And there is so much imagery in this opening page of description that you can dig into about the fact that he's following the current. He's a dead fish that goes with the flow. That immediately sets up Toma's personality. All of the junk and dead things in the river, the divide that the river creates, the river full of dead things, between him and his father on one side and his mother on the other. His mother who has a disability and is traumatized, while he sits on the other side with his father, fearing that he will become his father. There is a mutational quality to this relationship. And it's at that point you kind of understand why it's titled Cannibals. And we're only on page 2. The imagery is crass and brilliant in its crassness. And it doesn't stop. This kind of weirdly detailed imagery carries on all the way through this very, very short story. But, and I really have to emphasize this, if you think that you would be triggered by reading about abuse from the perspective of a man, do not read this novel. If it is going to upset you and traumatize you and trigger you, believe me, it will. If you think it will, it will. There is one particular scene in here from Thomas' perspective when he starts to succumb to his deepest fear, and it is a truly horrifying scene. I would kind of like to analyze it and talk about it, but that would be impossible on YouTube. Even if I did a spoiler video, I couldn't actually say anything that happens in this scene. It's too horrific, it's too upsetting. So when I say trigger warning, I really mean it. All of that said, Cannibals is still a very worthwhile story about the cycles of abuse. It's worthwhile because of the themes that it explores and the unique way in which we're seeing all of this from the perspective of a child who is just about to hit manhood and is terrified of what that means. What it means to have been raised by a father that you don't want to become. Your mother all but abandoned you, but sits as a kind of shadow just across the water, just out of reach. You are now of an age where you will do the things that your father does. And will you succumb to them? And when he does, what does that mean? Is he out of choices? Is he out of options? Did fate come for him, or is there something left? Is this a redeemable thing? What does redemption even mean in this particular context? Especially when you consider the feverish quality of it. There's a lot to think about. This is a very, very literary and thought-provoking thing. It is complex, it is complicated, it is unsettling and upsetting, and I really think there are going to be people who truly appreciate what it's doing, and other people who maybe could appreciate it if it wasn't for just how awful and triggering and upsetting and traumatizing it is. I think anyone who is tempted to call this torture porn or trauma porn from a hyper-masculine perspective is doing the book a disservice. But that doesn't mean I blame anyone for not reading it because they're afraid of what it might do to their mind and how it might affect them. That's fair. It really upset me. But if you can read it, if you can stomach it, there's a lot that you're going to get from it. There are a lot of themes here that you will be left to wrestle with in your own mind. You will sit there and ask yourself so many questions about heredity, about trauma, about inherited cycles of abuse, about masculine and patriarchal domination of women, about the roles of the mother and the father. There's a lot to think about here. And the imagery is beautiful in its darkness. And the feverish quality, the way that it is so claustrophobic and it will make you sweat and fear and feel isolated and alone and scared. It's amazing. It's not a horror story, but it certainly can affect you like one. I am amazed by Cannibals, but I cannot overemphasize enough. Tread lightly. If you can stomach it, you should enjoy it. Subscribe for books.